ties between India and Canada have hit a dramatic low point, especially when earlier this week, both the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, followed by the Canadian Prime Minister, further levied allegations that there is evidence of links between government of India officials and organized crime that has been carrying out murders, extortion, intimidation against Canadian South Asian citizens in Canada in the last few years. This has led to diplomatic tit for tat. 6 diplomats of India were withdrawn. New Delhi expelled 6 Canadian diplomats, including the acting High Commissioner. And we see a real chill in Canadian Indian ties. I have with me here today Terry Milewski, journalist, author, political commentator, and he's joining ThePrint from Canada to sort of discuss the current issues in Indo-Canadian ties. Thank you, sir, for joining ThePrint.
Thanks for the invitation.
So to get right in and start off with my first question, right? There is this sense, and I'm, connecting this to this idea of other groups that have been proscribed as terrorists by the Canadian government, especially in the last few days, and trying to compare that with this perceived soft approach with regards to Khalistan, especially by the Justin Trudeau administration in the last 9 years. And given your history working on this, I just want to get a sense of, is that perception that, one rule for Khalistanis, one rule for the other groups promoting separatism, how did that sort of sense or perception come to be, sir?
One way to begin answering that question, which is a good question, might be to look at the poll that was done more than a year ago now, on the occasion of the anniversary of the Air India bombing of 1985. We know that bombing took 331 completely innocent civilians' lives for nothing, and it was carried out by Khalistani terrorists living and with Canadian citizenship in Canada. And the poll showed that roughly 9 out of 10 Canadians had no clue what dimly remembered it. And most young people, by far the overwhelming majority of young people, said, "What was the Air India bomb? What was that? What are you talking about?" Canadians have a very comfortable country, and many of them live a comfortable life. And there's a certain complacency in many wealthy democracies that, we have a pretty good life and we don't really care about other people's problems. Even though Canada is a multi-ethnic country now, and it's a rainbow of color, but still a certain indifference attaches to affairs on the other side of the world, so much so that even though most of the victims of the Air India bombing, for example, were Canadian citizens of Indian extraction, the Canadian public didn't really seem to care about it. The Canadian police didn't really seem to care about it. And it's a true story, a sad story, which illustrates what I'm saying. 3 weeks before that bombing, on June the 1st of 1985, the government of India warned Canada of precisely such an attack being highly likely on one of their aircraft. We had to be absolutely sure that there would be meticulous, I'm quoting, meticulous baggage security because we're going to try to put bombs in the baggage. And the RCMP said, "Oh, God, those Indians again," they said. "They're always trying to get extra free security nobody else gets." And they shelved the warning. The telex landed on the shelf. They did nothing about it. 3 weeks later, the bombs blew up. Now, so that's a partial answer. I don't know if it's a very good answer, but it is a partial answer. Whereas the world saw what and was appalled by not just one, but many, very many terrorist acts by Palestinian groups. For example, when it came to the Khalistanis, for one, they couldn't even spell Khalistani. what that was. Number two, there was this one terrible event which did not grip the Canadian consciousness. It happened off the coast of Ireland, far away. The debris fell deep in the ocean. We barely ever saw any footage of the bodies. It was off our map. And to some extent, by the way, this is also true in India, which has no Air India memorial. Air India. Canada has 4 or 5, quite rightly. But I know some of the Air India victims' families still trying to get a memorial in India. So we can all, I think, take our lumps and plead guilty to this problem of indifference, which continues to this day and is manifest in what brings us here for this conversation. That is the sense that Canada has been whistling past the graveyard, ignoring and pandering to the threat of violence and actual violence by the Khalistanis resident and operating in Canada, and India apparently got fed up with it. And who's to say that they weren't quite correct to be angry about it? But to the point of murder, that's the question.
Right. And the reason I asked this question, because Prime Minister Trudeau, just about an hour before we started taping this interview, in front of the Foreign Interference Commission, went out and said, basically saying, firstly, that the Canadian government had no hard evidentiary proof of these links, but had some intelligence, right? When they first approached India in August last year, and then ties blew up. And now he says the RCMP has investigated, it has collected more evidence to support their claim. But it seems that even when he was making these comments, he was attempting to defend the freedom of speech of Canadians, and that it's merely that the Indian government doesn't like those speaking out against India. But these are people who've, made comments of asking Hindus to go back home because their home is not Canada, even if they're Canadian citizens. Right? These are people who have incited acts of extreme violence against Indian diplomats, putting up wanted posters, having, shooting these, anniversaries on Operation Blue Star with, mannequins of the death of Indira Gandhi. So, there's clear action there, that one could say is incitement to hatred. So how is it that, all of this is given sort of a free pass by the Canadian government when India says, look, this is a real issue for New Delhi,
Well, it's quite obvious. I think that vote bank politics has a lot to do with it. And I think that when the Indian side in the current dispute cites that as Trudeau's motivation, they're onto something, because it has become a tradition in Canada that even though the Khalistanis are not synonymous with Sikhs in Canada by any means at all, there's only a small minority of Sikhs in Canada who are Khalistanis. Nevertheless, they are politically the most active, and they're concentrated in certain electoral districts, upon which many Canadian federal elections turn. They go this way, that way, according to the tide. They're swing ridings, as we call them, in Ontario and British Columbia. So politicians are not crazy to kiss up to the Khalistani element, who are the most active when it comes to promising politicians blatantly. You sing my song, and I can get you elected with 10,000 votes out of the Gurdwara down the street where I'm on the executive. But if you don't sing my song, well, we can defeat you. We can switch to the other party. The other party, by the way, is quite ready to have them. It's not a liberal thing. Conservatives, the NDP, all guilty of the same pandering. Again, that's only a partial answer to your question. The freedom of speech question that you also raised there is central. And that is the idea, Canadians have the idea, quite correctly, that India wants us to just go around banning these people. That's not how it works in any free speech country. Canada is not unique in this respect, but I don't think in the United States or the United Kingdom or France, I don't think you just sort of ban people who aren't doing anything criminal. And it is not criminal. Stand on the street corner in Canada, hold up a yellow flag and speak guns in the mouth. There's nothing illegal about that. You make the point, and I agree with you on this. This is the central point that if you're putting up posters and machine gunning pictures of the Indian High Commissioner in Ottawa, are you not inciting violence? Well, I think that I could find quite a few lawyers who say that goes beyond freedom to speak. That's incitement of violence. And Canadian law, to be candid about it, I speak as a loyal Canadian. Canadian law is bankrupt in that respect. There is insufficient legal sanction to prohibit, for example, the glorification of terrorism. So the politicians in Canada, yes, can and do, and still to this day, voted by Saki Day Parade to the Guevara, which is a life-size glorified poster, with a handsome headdress, with a ceremonial sword, no less Canada's worst ever mass murderer, the Air India bomber himself, Kelvinder Singh Parmar. It's considered kosher. It's considered okay in Canada to glorify our worst ever mass murderer. So, as bad as you think it is, it's actually worse in some respects. And that, I think, that's where we have crossed the line so that this has become normalized. You also referred to the truck sailing down the main street of Brampton, Ontario last year with a life-size diorama, carefully produced, lots of blood on the Prime Minister's story, and this diorama was celebrating the assassination of Indira Gandhi in Bangkok. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous, but it's normal in Canada. So we've got our own problems to solve in Canada. And when the Indian side complains about that, and when the Indian side points to, oh, by the way, here's Justin Trudeau's tweet, which he applauds the assassination of the American of Ayman Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden's number 2. Remember that one? He got a Hellfire missile through his patio window. And so it's okay, apparently, for a Canadian Prime Minister to applaud that when our guys do it, when our American friends do it. It's not okay when the Indians do it. The problem here is the Indians say, we didn't do it. You have no evidence that we were involved at all. Well, unfortunately, there's abundant evidence on the public record. And I don't think the no evidence angle is going to hold up for very long, especially with not one, not two, but 3 criminal trials forthcoming, which are going to give the lie to the Indian position. They have a trial beginning on November the 4th, very, very soon now, of those 2 punks accused of the assassination of Rapudaman Singh Malik, one of the Air India bombing suspects who was acquitted in 2005. Then there'll be a trial of Nikhil Gupta in New York. He is accused as the handler, as it were, who was sent out to hire a hitman and dispose of Patwant Singh Panun of Sikhs for Justice. And then there'll be a trial of 4 young gangsters of Indian extraction who have been accused in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Surrey, British Columbia last year. And so a good deal of evidence will come out. Maybe they won't be able to trace a firm link to any Indian government official, but take a look at the at the American indictment of Gupta. Look at what they've got. Recordings. They were inside the plot. It was an undercover agent who personally heard Gupta, he says, that this was all one plot. That the plot against Panun in New York the same plot that was aiming at Niger in Canada. So the Indian line that, that is completely different. The American charge is very serious, but those Canadian charges totally different. Totally different. They're not. One plot, you can't take it very seriously on one hand, as the Indians say, and call it absurd, as they also say, when the same charges are made by the Canadians. That's not going to wash either. So both parties, in my view, have questions to answer. They're both going to have to swallow a little dose of humiliation in order to get out of the mess they both got us into.
Multiple questions that arise from, what you just said. And I just wanted to raise one or two from this, because I think you mentioned that, there are questions on both sides, and, both sides seem to be doubling down over their respective positions. Mr. Trudeau, during the Foreign Interference Commission hearing, was very categorical and said, there is evidence now. Maybe not in September last year, but now the RCMP has collected it. So what I want to ask you about that specific point is that by going public in September 2023 and then having the evidence gathered by the RCMP, which India has had a quite testy relationship, especially over the Kanishka bombing in 1985. How much of that, in a sense, could one argue is politically colored? And I know the RCMP prides itself on its independence. I'm not imputing anything here in that sense. But that's nevertheless a question, is that when there's intelligence and then evidence gathered after the fact, there are questions on how valuable that is. That's the first part of my question that I wanted to ask you. And then the second is, where does India and Canada go from here?
Let's deal with the first one first. No, can I deal with the second one first because it's shorter?
Yeah.
Where do they go from here? I think is a grubby little deal. That question to me is easy, and I'm just being cynical, but I see a grubby little deal. What I mean is that, look, we all know this is embarrassing. Why don't we cook up a deal? And such deals do happen in a world where, prisoner swaps, hardened criminal murderers are let out of jail in order to buy the freedom of one of our guys in a Russian prison. Dirty deals do happen. And one may be underway as we have seen a report. Don't know if it's all true. Haven't seen it much denied that the individual identified by the Washington Post have the Indian government employee. Americans didn't say the Indian government did it. They say an Indian government employee did it. But he hired Nikhil Gupta to go out and find a hitman to dispose of Panun. Well, then we see that he is faced with local charges. So perhaps he will have to pay some price in order to mollify the Americans who have insisted that they're being very polite. We're not blaming the government. We're not like Trudeau getting up in the House of Commons and making speak about the immorality of supposedly of the Indian government. The Americans have nevertheless been insisting on some accountability. You're not going to skate away from this. We are the world's policemen, the Americans think of themselves anyway. We're not going to tolerate rising superpowers like India, even if they're basically on our side and we don't want to do that. I don't think they should be running around the world. They certainly can't come to the United States to carry out blatant breaches of the law like murder. So you have to, pledge that you're not going to do this again. Easy enough for the Indians to say it privately, not on Indian TV. They'll privately say, oh, yeah, we're done with all of that. We're really going to go after the guilty here. And they will face these local charges. And I would bet a little money that in a couple of years, they're quietly released. The press release really talks about it. Didn't even know it. The guy will just pledge to go home and be quiet, not tell anyone that he was treated lightly. And in return, the Indians they'll have to tell some story to their public. Right now, Modi is riding high. He's tough. He's beating up on those Indians and defending the sovereignty of India. And he can tell them, look, we have really put the boots to the Canadian side. Look, they are pledging, and I think Canada should pledge, really, to crack down on the sort of pandering and toleration, coddling of Khalistanis that we've seen for 40 years now. I don't mean banning people who are breaking the law. I mean, you tell the members of your party, and you tell the members of your party that we are not going to have Canadian politicians, members of parliament, you're not going to get the party signature on your nomination. We're not going to back you. You will not go. The Baisakhi parades run by extremist Gurdwaras, which display glorifying posters, mass murder. That's at a minimum. You're going to have to do something about the fact that you have created this permissive environment for people who, as you rightly point out, are putting up posters full of machine gun holes of the Indian High Commission. That we can't have that. And I don't think, as I said earlier, that we should abolish freedom of speech. I don't think there'll be any appetite for that. I think a prime minister who has made a virtue of defending Canadian sovereignty says that is his real motivation, not a plot with the CIA to steer the Indian government or whatever other theory you have. It's a noble cause to defend the sovereignty of Canada. Okay, then, let's hear it. Let's hear you say, oh, this cabinet minister, that cabinet minister, and that member of parliament, if they're going to go to these parades and smile and wave and hustle for votes while the truck goes by with Indira Gandhi portrayed thereon with her sari covered ample amounts of red paint to make sure that children got the message, then you're not going to be running in my party. And we're going to act. We're going to say, no, that won't do. But we're against that kind of thing, remember? And this would be a small price to pay. It would benefit Canada as much as it benefits India. We did it. Everyone could pay, everyone could benefit.
Right, but that doesn't answer the first part of my question on this idea of the RCMP. Only because it's just the testy relationship, of this perception that RCMP doesn't take India seriously enough, but now has evidence after the allegations were made public. So,
yes, I apologize. I did skate past that. It wasn't intentional, but it is a harder question. Look, there was at the outset Canadian wire. There have been leaks. And one of them is that there was a Canadian wiretap showing a contact between somebody involved in the assassination plot and in Canada and a government official. We didn't at the time know who that government official was, and he was since been identified. And the Americans have a much more comprehensive surveillance operation, put it politely, and they were able to contribute evidence confirming what the impression was gained from the Canadian wiretap. That both had evidence, but the American evidence pitched it. And hence we have recordings, apparently, or the FBI says they have recordings of the plot being hatched. And they emphasize in the indictment, of course, that we see it at all times. The person they're accusing, they call him CC1 in the indictment. He's since been identified by the Washington Post as speaking of And he, at all times, the internet says, was an employee of the Indian government in intelligence, policing, and the like. Now, beyond that, um, you can call that intel, not evidence. A lot of people are making, excellent distinctions between one and the other, but it sounds like evidence to me. If you're on the phone, and if Nikhil Gupta is recorded telling his hired hitman, who is an undercover police officer, um, yeah, Nijjar is also a target of this plot, then yeah, that's evidence. It's intel and it's evidence, both. So uh, the argument that India is making now, that Trudeau's a bad man because his tactics are bad, going public without producing evidence. Well, okay, fine. I mean, we're not talking about the real issue, are we? But maybe Trudeau's a very bad man. He was crazy to make the charges with that. Let's stipulate for the purpose of argument that he was crazy to present these allegations without presenting any evidence. I criticize him myself for that. There are lots of us did look kind of odd, but it still doesn't deal with the real issue. That is murder. And now, at the same time, I haven't seen Canadian leaders or opposition politicians or anybody berating the Indian side for their lack of evidence. Where is your evidence, by the way, that Hardeep Singh Nijjar was, say, a terrorist? Now, I've reported, tweeted about his followers, Nijjar's followers, in his Gurdwara after his murder, putting up fine posters of him, one of the posters in the Gurdwara, with the Khalistan Tiger Force logo on it, confirming the core allegation by the Indian government that he was, in his private life, not a plumber, but a terrorist. Well, his supporters kind of gave that one away, didn't they, when they put up that poster? So, nevertheless, there has been traditionally a shortage of evidence coming from the Indian side to persuade the Canadians to deliver up or to extradite persons identified by India as terrorists over the years, over the same 40-year period, the India case. And so both sides are guilty of being perhaps not overburdened with convincing evidence. And the Indian side has traditionally felt, well, he's a designated terrorist. It's closed. He's been designated. Have you read the judgment of Chief Justice Patel of the Delhi High Court, in which he endorses, he rubber stamps the government's decision to designate Sikhs for Justice as a terrorist organization? Well, where does it say there that what are the terrorist acts that they carried out exactly? And you may have to turn back to the beginning and try again, take a second read, find exactly what the terrorist acts are the purpose has been carried out. So being accused isn't enough in Canada or the United States, but in India carries a lot of weight. So different standards, different cultures. Both sides, I think, are guilty of not having enough to back up their case, and we shall see if they prove me wrong.
Right, and that's a very sort of interesting, I think, ending is that different standards and different cultures, which I think really also speaks to, I think, a lot of the talking across we see between Indian and Canadian diplomats. That was my last question, sir, and I would really like to thank you once again for joining ThePrint to have this discussion on the status of India and Canada and the diplomatic ties.
I think you asked the right questions too. That helped.
Right. Thank you so much, sir.